Let's talk about designing the audit procedures, sending confirmations, doing inventory counts, anything like that. How are we going to design those specific procedures? The auditor should design and perform further audit procedures whose nature, timing, and extent, we see this over and over, are responsive to the assessed risks of material misstatement at the relevant assertion level. The purpose is to provide a clear linkage between the nature, timing, and extent of the further audit procedures and the risk assessments. In designing the further audit procedures, what should we consider? Well, we should consider the significance of the risk, the likelihood in each particular account that a misstatement could occur. If every year their debt account has a misstatement, that is something to take into account, and we should possibly test debt more. The characteristics of the class of transactions, account balance, or disclosure involved. If it's something that is more susceptible to fraud, such as cash, we may want to increase the nature, timing, and extent. The nature of the specified controls used by the entity in particular, whether they're manual or automated. Are people involved in the internal controls, or is it in automated control? You can see pros and cons to either of those. And whether the auditor expects to obtain audit evidence to determine if the entity's controls are effective in detecting or preventing or detecting material misstatements. If you obtain evidence about the controls, that is going to allow you to test. Lastly, here, the nature of the audit procedures is of most importance in responding to the assessed. Assessment of identified risks. Well, the auditor's assessment of the identified risks at the relevant assertion level provides a basis for considering the appropriate audit approach for designing and performing further audit procedures. In some cases, the auditor may determine that performing only substantive procedures is appropriate for specific relevant assertions and risks, which generally, yeah, you're just going to do normal audit testing. In those circumstances, the auditor may exclude the effective controls from the relevant risk assessment. So remember, that's the combined approach, is doing both. In some cases, you may say it's totally fine to just do the normal substantive approach. But this could be because the auditor's risk assessment procedures have not identified any effective controls relevant to the assertion. That's actually interesting, because if there are no controls, first off, if the controls are not effective, you're not going to test them. Like if you identify internal controls as not being effective at all, there's no point to test them. Or maybe they're just not relevant at all. Maybe there's just no controls as it relates to the PP&E account. If there's no controls, there's nothing to test, so you wouldn't use the combined approach. Or because testing the operating effectiveness of controls would be inefficient. Maybe for whatever reason, it's just going to take thousands of hours and cost thousands of lives. However, the auditor needs to be satisfied that performing only substantive procedures for the relevant assertions would be effective in reducing detection risk to an acceptably low level. Use your professional judgment. If you think that doing substantive procedures alone is fine, then you're good to go with that. The auditor often will determine that a combined audit approach using both of these is an effective approach. Really just talking about here, how are we going to assess what we're going to use depends on you. Let's talk about audit procedures related to assertions. Now, this is something we go very much in depth with when it comes to revenue cycle, expenditure cycle. And remembering here that we have assertions related to the transactions, which is the income statement, account balance, which is the balance sheet, and disclosure, which is, say, the notes, the financial statements, and the overall understandability of the financial statements as a whole. Regardless of the approach selected, the auditor should design and perform procedures for all relevant assertions, each material class. So every one of these that's material. So if the company is a multi-billion-dollar company and they've got $100 of interest income, you're probably not going to test that. Let's be honest. It's not very material there. However, for the material classes of these three, you're going to want to identify tests for existence, completeness, occurrence, all of those. And as we've seen in the past, for example, when it comes to auditing cash, auditing the cash rec as well as sending out bank confirmations is going to pretty much assess all of the assertions as it relates to cash, except for cutoff. So you can do one or two tests that are going to cover the majority of the assertions. And remember, these are the management assertions. Have those memorized. Just a general check in there. Because effective internal controls are generally reduce but do not eliminate the risk of material misstatement. Test controls reduce but do not eliminate the need for substantive procedures. Effective internal controls, they're great. You should have them, right? They're mitigating. Nothing can eliminate risk overall. Solid tests of controls will never eliminate the need for substantive procedures. You're always going to need to do your audit basically you're always going to need to do your job. You're always going to need to verify something, make inquiries. In addition, analytical procedures alone may not be sufficient in some cases. I think that goes without saying. And this is an audit, remember, this is not a review, whereas analytical procedures are your number one friend. So, for example, when auditing certain estimation processes, such as examining the allowance for doubtful accounts, the auditor may perform substantive procedures beyond analytical procedures. For example, examining cash collections subsequent to period end due to the risk of management override of controls or the subjectivity of the account balance. Yeah, gotta love those practical examples. Make note of all these. I think they're all incredibly very helpful. Let's talk about the nature of further audit procedures. The nature of these procedures refers to their purpose. So we talked about the nature, the extent, the timing. The nature of procedures. So if you want to memorize nature of procedures is the purpose of them. What's the purpose of either the test of controls or substantive procedures? And their type, whether it's an inspection, a recalculation, inquiry, any of these, making note of these. Certain procedures may be more appropriate for some assertions than others, and that's something we're going to do our best to drill in. That's something you can easily see as a sim. Something you can easily see as other multiple choice questions as well. You want to understand which procedures are done for which assertions. And we've got that spread throughout multiple of our lessons here. We'll talk about that much more for us as we continue on. So, for example, here in relation to revenue, tests of controls may be most responsive to the assessed risk of misstatement of the completeness assertion. So completeness, making sure that revenue is complete, that all revenue that should be recorded is actually recorded. Whereas substantive procedures may be most responsive to the assessed risk of material misstatement of the occurrence assertion. Let's actually think about this for a second. Tests of controls. These are just the internal controls of the company that just are running in the background or maybe actively functioning. The completeness assertion, this is concerned about the understatement of revenue. In this case, we're worried that we're not including all of our revenue. Now, what is the general inclination of management? It's to overstate revenue to make them look better. So tests of controls, where you're not actually looking at the numbers, right? It would be better to make sure that the controls are operating effectively to catch all revenue, making sure that every department is matching documents and not letting any possible sales get unrecorded. Whereas making sure that all revenue actually did occur, which is more worried about the overstatement of revenue, which management is more likely to do on purpose, right? Not including all revenue is probably more of an error. Including too much revenue is probably fraud. Probably, right? It doesn't have to be. It could still be an error. This is just super important, and I think a pretty big light bulb moment here. By you actively doing substantive procedures to actually test the dollar amounts of revenue, that's going to help you to determine if revenue is possibly overstated. We see there, this is a great example, determining the difference there. God, I'm such a nerd for this stuff. I mean, I guess I kind of have to be, in order for us to have a good time here and for me to effectively communicate it all to you. But I hope you're having a good time as well. And, hopefully you become an accounting nerd just like I am.
Hey there! Are you ready to not only pass your CPA exams, but truly understand and enjoy the material while studying? I know it seems impossible, right? Especially to enjoy the material? We'll do it together. Tap into the power of CPA.examprep.ai, where we've got personalized quizzes, multiple choice questions, memorization guides, flashcards, simulations, all tailored to your learning. Our adaptive study planning puts you on the fastest path to success and lifts you back up if you fall behind. Avoid wasting your precious time and money attempting an exam with a low chance of passing, because who wants that? We want to get you through this process as quick as possible. Our exam readiness prediction lets you walk in with confidence, knowing that you're prepared for success on exam day. Thankfully, there's no payment method needed to get started, so why don't you come join us? Visit cpa.examprep.ai and let's achieve your exam success together.